My name is Erin Lasley. I've traveled many different roads in my life. I've been a law enforcement officer and first responder in the United States Coast Guard. I've worked in a couple of psychiatric hospitals, but now I'm a professional historian and podcaster. I've also had an interest in true crime for most of my life. In this podcast, I study some of the most notorious crimes through the lens of a historian and analyze what may have inspired criminals, investigators, and even society during the commission of those crimes and investigations. Join me as we look into the history behind the crime. Hello, all you true crime and history fans. Welcome to Season 3 of The History Behind the Crime. How are y'all doing? How's life treating you? I have been busy, so busy, after a huge life transition. But I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on in the podcast. I've also been busy responding to all of your emails, and I have so felt the love over the last couple of months with all of your emails and messages welcoming me back to the light and sharing your own stories of triumphing over blawedness and depression. It just gives even more credence to what I've always said. You're not alone. Most of us have been there. Many of us have overcome the struggle and found ways of getting back to good. Whether it's been through therapy, medication, or changing habits, we've walked back into the light. Your struggle is real, and you shouldn't be ashamed to seek help. We all need help at different times in our lives, and there are people out there who have not only been in your place, but they are eager to help you out of a jam. Don't give up, and keep up the good fight. I wanted to talk to you today about a case that made waves in the United States military in the 1990s. You should know, if you talk to any woman who joined the U.S. military before the last decade, many of them will tell you stories about sexual harassment and or sexual assault. Those who don't have a personal story know someone who does. And as much as I love the U.S. military, I love the military. I served in the military. I serve in the military today as a civilian. But as much as I love it, it has always had a problem with sexual harassment and assault. It is making headway, but it still has a long way to go. Throughout its history, there have been some really bad scandals within its ranks, some quite recently. The United States Coast Guard's foul anchor scandal, the murder of Army Specialist Vanessa Guion in 2020, and the arrest of dozens of Army instructors who sexually assaulted students. That's just to name a few. There will probably be more in the future. And for those of you who think this is just a phase stemming from women serving in the military, women have served in the U.S. military since the Revolutionary War. And before we go a lot farther, if you hear actually I have a lot of this written down on paper, so you're going to hear the pages stirring every now and again. As many of you know, women have served right alongside men in the U.S. military since the Revolutionary War. During those early years, if women were not acting as nurses, mending and washing clothes, or acting as the camp cook, they were spying for the Continental Army or disguising themselves as men so they could fight right alongside the Continental Army. During the Civil War, approximately 20,000 women volunteered to assist the Union forces as laundresses, cooks, in collecting donations for troops, and some 6,000 more women joined the Union Army as nurses. Some 1,000 women actually took up arms disguised as men. 1,000 women, not just onesies and twosies. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker had to fight to serve as a doctor in the Union Army. The Union was desperate for good surgeons, but at first the military refused to let her serve as a doctor simply because she was a woman. Can you believe that? I mean, simply because she had a Yahoo instead of a ding-dong. Dr. Walker believed in the Union's cause so greatly that she volunteered as an unpaid surgeon and served on the front lines of Fredericksburg and Chattanooga, which were heavy, heavy battles. And she did that before the Army finally hired her as a surgeon. She was actually the first female surgeon in the United States Army. During her military service, Dr. Walker would cross enemy lines to serve the sick and injured, and even did a little spying before she was captured by Confederate forces. She did spend a few months in Confederate prisons, which were just horrible, and then spent the rest of the war treating orphans and female prisoners. In 1865, President Andrew Johnson awarded Dr. Walker with the Congressional Medal of Honor. And though it was stripped from her in 1917, once again, merely because she was a woman, President Jimmy Carter posthumously restored it to her in 1977. Dr. Walker is the only woman to have received that honor. During World War I, over 3,000 female American nurses served in hospitals in France. Over 2,000 women served as yeomen in the United States Navy. And the U.S. Army Signal Corps enlisted women to work as telephone and switchboard operators fairly close to the front lines. All of these women were allowed to serve openly. During World War II, nearly 350,000 American women joined the armed forces. And I'm not just talking about Rosie's the Riveters, who themselves were badasses. But these women who enlisted or became officers in the United States military. We're talking about pilots, nurses, intel, logistics. They were translators and admin support and drivers and mechanics and so much more. Every branch of the military took these women on because they needed them and began to see the true contributions women made to their countries. During the war, 432 female American service members were killed, and another 88 were taken prisoner of war. In 1948, President Harry Truman passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, which allowed women to serve as full-time members of the United States military and not just serve in reserve roles. Though the act limited just how many women could serve in the military, just about 2% of the armed forces. And some women were discharged if they became pregnant. It was still a big step forward, especially when the U.S. entered the Korean War and was on constant alert during the Cold War. During the conflict in Vietnam, President Lyndon B. Johnson finally opened the ranks of general and flag officers up to women, and women could finally command units that included men. In 1994, President Bill Clinton rescinded the, quote, risk rule, essentially allowing women to serve in all positions in the military except for ground combat roles. This was done after more than 40,000 women deployed during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And the military realized Keeping women from the front was handicapping the military. And finally, in 2013, then Defense Secretary Leon Panetta announced that the ban on women in combat would be lifted entirely, and that female service members would be allowed to serve in direct combat roles. Women have always served in the U.S. military, but unfortunately have always been the subjects of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Through my studies, I've read accounts of World War II active duty Women's Army Air Corps being harassed by male counterparts and even female spouses. These women who volunteered to serve their country were called immoral, easy, and sluts because people chose to believe these brave women joined the army to get a man rather than to serve their country when their country needed them the most. From the beginning of the U.S. military to actually quite recently, there have been little to no recourses for U.S. military women to report sexual harassment and assault. And even if a woman did report harassment or assault, she was either not believed or everything was swept aside. The American public didn't really care either until all hell broke loose in a Vegas hotel in 1991. In 1956, a group of Navy and Marine aviators got together to just, hang out and swap stories, because that's what we do. They called their club the Tailhook Association. At first, they met in San Diego because there's a huge Navy and Marine presence there, but then moved their annual get-togethers to Vegas in 1968 when more and more aviators started to attend. Though the shindig started off as, an informal thing, the U.S. Navy and Marines kind of made it a semi-official conference that featured, presentations, forums, and whatnot about military aviation operations. Pretty soon, flag officers, those are admirals, y'all, and contractors began to attend, and the Department of Defense even provided military aircraft for travel. And let me tell you how big of a deal that is. I mean, that is super expensive. By 1991, approximately 14,000 people were members of the Tailhook Association, and 96% of them were men. During the day, attendees sat through business-like presentation and panels, but at night, the convention turned into a party so debauched that even the most rowdy frat boys would look like Mormon missionaries in comparison. Just how debauched are we talking? Military contractors and Navy and Marine squadrons would set up these so-called hospitality suites at the Las Vegas Hilton, which, they hosted the convention. And these suites would provide copious amounts of booze and strippers and encourage binge drinking and sexual activity. In 1986, after the release of, Top Gun and, everybody started bowing down to Tom Cruise, the party got so out of hand that attendees swore they witnessed Secretary of the Navy John Lehman perform sexual acts with a stripper in front of some 100 people. Sounds like a normal time in Vegas, right? Yeah, maybe for a bachelor party. But these are Navy and Marine aviators. We're talking about, they're there on the taxpayer's dime. and were flown there by the United States military. And let me tell you, it costs tens of thousands of dollars to fly just one of those aircraft halfway across the country. More than that, U.S. military officers and enlisted personnel are held to a higher standard than the general public. They also follow a different set of laws called the Uniform Code of Military Justice that does include ethical codes, such as not acting like a total jackass in public. Okay, maybe nothing that specific, but a whole bunch of judge advocates wouldn't have a difficult time spinning it that way. Two of the most favored events amongst these drunken sailors and Marines were ball walking and the gauntlet. Ball walking, and forgive me for repeatedly rolling my eyes, is basically a dude hanging his berries outside his unzipped pants and walking around exposed. The Tailhook attendees didn't just do this on the hospitality suite floor, but they also misbehaved on the pool patio for all to see. And trust me, this little stunt has not gone away. I remember men doing this when I was active duty in the early 2000s, both at my station and at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. It's incredibly immature and quite disgusting because no one wants to see that. Ugh. However, I would rather be a witness to bull walking rather than a victim of the gauntlet. These drunk-ass aviators would line the third-floor hallway of the Hilton and slap stickers of their squadron's emblems on anyone who passed by, normally women. Of course, not only were they plastering their emblems on these women, but they were sexually assaulting them too. Groping them, pinching them, trying to strip these women's clothes off, and propositioning them. The Hilton was partly to blame for this. Rather than telling Tailhook to knock it off, the Hilton instead chose to warn its female employees to avoid the third floor. If a female employee had to visit the third floor, it was their own fault if they got harassed and assaulted, or so management and attendees believed. To be completely fair, after Tailhook 86, higher-ups in the Navy and Marines were a bit concerned about the gross misbehavior of their aviators. The Navy started to crack down on the drunken revelries and out-of-control hospitality suites and demanded a more professional attitude from its sailors and Marines. Before Tailhook 91, a message was sent out that the previous behavior would not be tolerated, and the Tailhook Association told the attendees there would be so-called hall monitors roaming around the hospitality suites to ensure good conduct and discipline. Yeah, like a hall monitor ever stopped a sailor or Marine from having a good time. But the Navy's prior head-in-the-sand attitude about sexual harassment and sexual assault pretty much ensured it would happen again at another Tailhook. I found this paragraph in a journal report about Tailhook 91. Quote, "The emphasis on sexual-related activities set a tone or manifested an attitude towards women that is incompatible with the increasing role of women in the military and inconsistent with the Navy's policy of not tolerating sexual harassment. The emphasis as women as sex objects by some was clearly unprofessional and should have raised questions within the Department of Defense and Navy leadership as to whether it represented the tip of the iceberg, a widespread, unwholesome attitude toward women that would need correction." Tailhook 91 would be the largest event ever, with over 4,000 attendees, including 22 squadrons, flag officers, contractors, the Chief of Naval Operations, and the Secretary of the Navy. A different SecNav, not the one with the stripper. Anyway, Tailhook 91 also took place a few months after the end of Operation Desert Storm, an operation that naval aviators took a big part in. These aviators were ready to rehash their war stories and learn from missions the Navy and Marines had participated in, and obviously, party. The beginning of the conference kind of went off without a hitch. People caught up with each other, attended programming, and were just generally thankful they made it through some pretty hairy situations during Desert Shield and Desert Storm. All seemed to be going well until the flag officer panel, where admirals answered questions from the audience. During the panel, a female attendee asked when women would be able to fly combat missions. Seems like an innocent question. However, some audience members jeered her, but Vice Admiral R.M. Dunleavy, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, remained calm and answered with the standard non-answer. Quote, "If Congress directs SecNav to allow women to fly combat aircraft, we will comply," which doesn't really answer the question. The answer was met with boos, laughter, and catcalls. The question and the answer generated audience comments described as downright ugly. That's when many felt that the collective mood of the attendees went into a downward spiral and served as the catalyst for acts against women later that night. After the banquet that Saturday evening, about 3,000 people roamed around the notorious third-floor hallway, the hospitality suites, and the pool. Once again, to be fair, most of these people weren't looking for trouble. They were just there to blow off a little steam and have a little innocent fun, and then turn in for the night. But, you know, the phrase, it's always the few that ruin it for the rest of us. Side note. There were some female aviators and officers who were willing participants that night, and who even committed sexual assault against their male counterparts by conducting equipment checks, which is grasping the groin area of a man through his pants and pulling down the pants of unsuspecting male officers in public. Other activities these women participated in included men shaving women's legs, navel shots, and chicken fights in the pool. These women were just as guilty at perpetuating the sexual assaults that occurred that night against other women. Women can be offenders too. Men can be victims too. By 10 p.m. that night, the party was in full swing. Alcohol flowed freely on the third floor, and even by the Hilton pool. In the wilder hospitality suites, paid female entertainers, aka strippers and sex workers, performed strip shows, and stag films played on TVs. Stag films, just a nicer way of saying pornography. In the third floor hallway, the gauntlet had formed. And I'm just wondering, where were these so-called hall monitors? I don't know. Where was the brass to put a stop to the gauntlet? Probably having drinks in the hospitality suites. Liquored up sailors and Marines filled the hallway and would accost women who walked by. The sailors and Marines groped, grabbed, and pinched women. Some women were lifted up by the crowd and carried down the hallway while their shirts were yanked off of them. Truthfully, some women who were interviewed admitted they did not mind the unruly attention. Other women said stop and no and fought against their attackers. The women who fought back had drinks thrown in their faces. Sometime after 11 p.m., an intoxicated and semi-unconscious 18-year-old female was passed down the hall. She stumbled from man to man, barely able to walk, as the men stripped her of her clothes including her underwear. Apparently, this went a little too far for two Hilton security officers who were on the scene but failed to stop any of the assaults that had previously occurred that evening. The guards finally intervened and got the teenage girl to safety. And the aviators continued to party. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Paula Coughlin, a helo pilot and aide-de-camp to Rear Admiral Jack Snyder, had to walk down the hall. Being an aide-de-camp can put a target on your back because you are the gatekeeper to that person that you assist. People either love you or they hate you. When Lieutenant Coughlin walked down the hall, the men started to yell, "Admiral's aide," which made her even more vulnerable to their attention. Two men grabbed her buttocks and propelled her forward through the gauntlet. Lieutenant Coughlin told the men to cut it out, but her objections were ignored. Another man grabbed the lieutenant from behind and shoved his hands up her shirt as he took her to the ground. Lieutenant Coughlin fought back and managed to get away, only for another man to shove his hand into her pants and try to yank at the crotch of her underwear. Again, the lieutenant broke free and tried to enlist the assistance of an older man to help her. But instead, he grabbed her breasts. Lieutenant Coughlin finally dove into an empty hospitality suite and wept. Later, two officers Lieutenant Coughlin trusted escorted her to her hotel room. The party was not contained to the third floor. By the pool, aviators drank and bullwalked, and on the 8th floor, aviators mooned spectators and accidentally pushed the glass out of a window, sending it plummeting to the pool patio below. The glass smashed against the concrete and hit a female college student in the head, sending her to the hospital with a concussion. Obviously, these aviators didn't get the memo about keeping the drunken revelries to a minimum. Each squadron's alcohol bill for that evening averaged $7,000. And the total hotel damage bill was $23,000 in 1991. These guys put 1980s hair bands to shame. Here's the thing you need to know about Lieutenant Coughlin. She's a badass. Not just because she went to her superiors and lodged formal complaints, but because she went to their superiors as well. In the military, that takes some serious balls. Preferably the ones that are kept in your pants. The next morning after the gauntlet, Lieutenant Coughlin told her boss, Rear Admiral Snyder, what happened, pretty much telling him that she was almost gang raped by a group of pilots. He didn't seem that interested in the conversation and simply responded by asking her, "Well, what did you expect would happen when you went through the gauntlet?" On September 19th, Lieutenant Coughlin set up another meeting with Admiral Snyder and his director of staff and gave a detailed account of the attack. Snyder promised to inform his superiors. And he didn't, because by this time everybody was used to sweeping this stuff underneath the carpet. At the end of September, Lieutenant Coughlin took action and wrote a letter to Vice Admiral Jeremy Borda, Chief of Navy Personnel, who in turn went to Admiral Dunleavy and Jerome Johnson, Vice Chief of Naval Operations. Dunleavy ordered the Naval Investigative Service, now the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, to open an investigation into Lieutenant Coughlin's claims. The investigation began on October 11th. That same day, a letter was mailed out to the squadrons that participated in Tailhook 91. The letter outlined the more serious offenses that occurred during Tailhook and included the underage teen girl who was drunk and attacked, the verbal and physical abuse against women, and the $23,000 worth of damages. A journalist with the San Diego Union just happened to get a hold of a copy of that letter and published a story that was picked up by the Associated Press and republished in almost every newspaper across the U.S. with the title, "Women Reportedly Abused by Navy Pilots at Seminar." One of the people who read the story was former Navy aviator and Vietnam POW, Senator John McCain. Now, I don't care what you think about John McCain's politics. The man was the ultimate American hero. He not only volunteered to serve his country during a time of war, but he kept the faith in his country while he was beaten, tortured, and starved in a North Vietnamese prison and continued to serve in the U.S. Navy after his release in 1973. He knew how aviators were expected to conduct themselves, and the stories coming out of Tailhook made him angry. On the Senate floor, Senator McCain criticized the U.S. Navy, called for high-level investigations, and for the Navy to cut ties with Tailhook. Senator McCain also wrote a letter to Colin Powell, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time. And he also addressed that letter to Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, to open an independent commission to investigate the incident. The DoD said no. Why? Probably because of what had occurred 2 weeks before Senator McCain sent out that letter. On July 1st, 1991, President George H.W. Bush nominated Clarence Thomas to fill the vacancy left by Justice Thurgood Marshall. During the confirmation hearings, Anita Hill, former colleague of Thomas, testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee that Thomas had sexually harassed her. The hearing and the allegations Miss Hill made against Thomas could be its own episode because of the blatant attacks against Miss Hill by the Senate Judiciary Committee and other politicians and the FBI investigation into Miss Hill's claim. Needless to say, the committee hearings put sexual harassment on the front page of every newspaper in the U.S. for weeks, and the Bush administration really didn't want more of the same. That's a big reason why Powell and Cheney declined to authorize an independent investigation. It was simply pure politics and screw the women. While the DoD, as a whole, wasn't willing to do anything, the Navy wanted to send a strong message that they did not tolerate sexual harassment or assault. A larger investigation, aside from the one NIS conducted, did occur. Secretary of the Navy, Henry Garrett, not only ordered the Navy to cut ties with Tailhook, but ordered the Naval Inspector General, IG, to open an investigation into the business relationships between the Navy and Tailhook, and gave IG investigators a broader scope of investigation and more resources. IG agents investigated aggressively. Yay! But stupidly. Boo. These agents pulled off the gloves and went after anyone who played even a small part in the Tailhook assaults. They were so brutal in their investigation that many officers accused the investigators of using trickery, lying, and good cop, bad cop techniques, which, by the way, the Supreme Court has ruled cops can do, but also involved officers' wives in the interrogations and forcing interviewees to participate in polygraphs, which is just not cool. The investigators justified their actions by claiming that many of the officers were deceitful, no shit, and invasive, no shit, and their investigatory conduct was the only way to get the truth, which any good investigator would say was complete and total BS. So, okay, fine. But most of the interviews were not recorded because the IG thought the transcription would be too expensive. Later, prosecutors would only have the investigators' notes to rely on, which just pretty much sunk any and all prosecutions. Good job, guys. The IG's report was released on April 23rd, 1993, and this is what it found. 83 women and 7 men were assaulted at Tailhook 91, and a bulk of the victims were civilians who had no connection to the military. 300 Navy and Marine officers were identified as having committed some sort of offense, ranging from penny ante stuff to conduct unbecoming to assault. Out of the 300, 140 were referred for disciplinary actions. Aside from these 140 officers, there were 35 case files on flag officers, admirals, who in some way, shape, or form had some part to play in the incident as well. Side note, when you start talking about flag or general officers, things do get a bit hairier. Whether it's because the military wants to protect their own, or investigations taking a lot longer because investigators and prosecutors want to dot every I and cross every T. These are men and women who have spent decades learning and perfecting their craft in order to defend the United States. The government has invested millions of dollars into them, and a lot of trust too. There have been admirals and generals who have gotten away with a lot of shit that the rest of us would have wound up in prison for. But there have been several who have suffered the consequences for their actions or inactions, as was the case after Vanessa Guillen's murder at Fort Hood, when 14 senior officers, including Major General Scott F. Lant, were fired or reprimanded for Vanessa's death, and allowing an environment of harassment and assault to fester on the base. Quite recently, an Air Force general was just put through a court-martial for sexual assault. They are finally being held accountable for their misdeeds. In the military, jurisdiction for crimes normally falls under the commanding officer of a unit. He or she will either be the one to hand out punishment or refer to a courts-martial. After the release of the report, the Navy consolidated all the criminal cases under one convening authority, rather than letting, separate chain of commands take care of their own people. By doing this, the Navy can make any punishments more consistent and avoid further conflict of interest that could come back and haunt the Navy later on. And all of this would haunt the Navy for a very long time. Out of the 140 cases referred for disciplinary actions, 12 were dropped because they were considered too weak to prosecute. Out of the remaining, 50 more were dropped for lack of evidence. For those cases which there was no evidence of sexual assault, these officers were offered admiral's mast, which is a form of non-judicial punishment where you make your case to one person, the admiral, and he or she decides whether punishment should be handed out or not. Punishments range normally from a verbal scolding to letters of reprimand to reduction of rank. Punishment is not a criminal conviction, but it does go on a person's service record, which could sink their career later on. The 42 officers charged with conduct unbecoming for ball walking, or streaking, chose Admiral's Mast, which was probably a good idea. 2 were exonerated. 12 received non-punitive letters and a scolding. And 28 received fines up to $2,000 and were issued punitive letters of reprimand, which once again probably sunk their careers. 4 officers rejected an Admiral's Mast and decided to take their chances with courts-martial. Okay. Out of the officers who were referred to courts-martial, 2 Marines were charged with sexual harassment and or sexual assault, but both cases were dismissed for lack of evidence. Out of the 5 naval officers referred to courts-martial, all of the cases were dropped. In the summer of 1993, Secretary of Defense Lou Aspin transferred the 35 flag officer files to incoming Secretary of the Navy John Dalton. 32 out of the 35 admirals received a formal reprimand. Before the investigation even happened, Admiral Snyder, the dickhead that didn't listen to Lieutenant Coughlin, was relieved of command of the Pax River Naval Air Station for not responding to Lieutenant Coughlin's accusations. Admiral Frank Kelso, Chief of Naval Operations, who was also there that night, was forced to retire because he failed to ensure due process for accused personnel. Then Secretary of the Navy, Garrett, had to resign in June 1992 because of the scandal. All in all, everyone involved received slaps on the wrist. No prosecutions whatsoever. For Lieutenant Coughlin, her career was pretty much over. I mean, she was not going to go anywhere. Though President Bush sympathized with her, Secretary of Defense Cheney blamed her for him having to fire the Secretary of the Navy because it was her fault she got sexually harassed. After Tailhook, Lieutenant Coughlin faced repeated abuse and retaliation and was pushed into resigning her commission in February 1994. Though Lieutenant Coughlin didn't receive justice through the Navy, she did drag Tailhook Association and the Las Vegas Hilton through the ringer and won a settlement against them. A jury concluded the hotel had been negligent in not providing adequate security at the convention and was forced to pay out a little more than $5 million. Paula Coughlin continues to speak for sexual harassment and sexual assault victims and now owns a yoga studio in Florida. Unfortunately, the Tailhook scandal, it didn't stop sexual harassment and assault in the military. It did convince Congress to lift the restriction on women flying in combat, but harassment and assault continued. Before he left office, Secretary of the Navy Secnav Garrett formed the working group Standing Committee on Women in the Navy and Marine Corps, which in 1992 made a list of 80 recommendations to improve how the Navy addressed issues, including sexual assault and alcohol abuse. The Navy approved all 80 recommendations. In 1994, some 90,000 U.S. service members were surveyed by the Department of Defense. We called them climate surveys. Out of the uniformed women surveyed, 55% had been sexually harassed at least once in the prior year. Out of embarrassment, the United States military made greater efforts to address the problem through increased training and more severe prosecutions. While these efforts did benefit the United States military, it failed to change sexual harassment and rape culture within the ranks. And it failed to address bias some commanders faced when they prosecuted sexual harassment, and assault offenders within their ranks. The carrot was the training that told the military members not to harass and rape, but the stick was somewhat lacking. Some commanders did not want to, quote, ruin a good man's career, or would seek prosecution against victims who had conducted minor offenses during their attacks, such as underage drinking. Though many more women in uniform did start to report sexual harassment and assault after Tailhook, many did not, for fear that they would not be believed, or they would be retaliated against, or nothing would be done. It was not until December 29th, 2023, when the Department of Defense took the investigative prosecutorial authority from unit commanders and handed them to special trial counsels who will decide whether to press charges or send to trial offenders in sexual harassment and assault cases. This move also covered murder, domestic violence, child abuse, and other crimes. This move was spurred on by the murder of Vanessa and gave victims more courage to file unrestricted reports, knowing and unbiased authority would investigate their cases. Things did get a little bit better after Tailhook, but there were still issues. And I can attest to this firsthand. I joined the Coast Guard in 2004 and encountered gender bias, sexual harassment, and sexual assault. I remember one particular evening when I was just an E3, I was just a seaman, when a warrant officer thought it would be funny to slap my backside at a social event. And later that same evening, a lieutenant shoved his hand up my shirt. To make matters even worse, a male petty officer witnessed the event and advised me not to tell anyone because he didn't want me to get into trouble. Why would I get into trouble? Because I was intoxicated. And the incident could have been spun to where it was my fault. As a junior enlisted person, I didn't want to get into trouble. And I didn't know of the resources and recourses at my disposal. The sexual harassment and assault training back then was laughable. Today, it is a lot better and it is taken very seriously. The training not only addresses recourses, but tries to stamp out rape culture too. And there are also a lot of resources out there for victims, including medical care and counseling. And a victim of harassment or assault can choose between filing a restricted report, which does not trigger an investigation, and your case, your commander will never know, or they can file an unrestricted report, which does trigger an investigation. Even with a restricted report, a victim can still receive medical care and counseling. And what I really like about some of these new programs is the CATCH program. So the Catch a Serial Offender program gives adult sexual assault victims an opportunity to anonymously submit suspect information to help the Department of Defense identify serial offenders. Even victims who submit restricted reports can still use the CATCH program to submit information about their attackers. And this can be anything, such as if the victim knows the name of their attacker, or identifying traits, if the attacker said anything to them, specific things their attackers did to them. This can all be put into the database. And it gives the DoD the opportunity to spot trends and track down serial offenders within the military. Finally, I just want to add one thing. Despite the sexual harassment and sexual assault problems within the military, I still love the military. I still encourage people to join if they are a good fit for the armed services. I found that the younger generation who are coming in have zero tolerance for harassment and assault and are more likely to stop their fellow soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen from committing these offenses. This new generation, it's more open, it's more inclusive, and it recognizes the differences that make our force stronger rather than weaker. Many of these new recruits celebrate the badass men and women amongst them and strive to be like them. I have seen this new generation shut down people who say stupid things, and they use the chain of command to stop sexual harassment. I am very proud of them and see an encouraging future in the military because of them. So earlier I teased that I had made a big life transition. And since the last episode, I moved across the country to Illinois to take up a new posting. I'm very excited to be here, but I do miss the Pacific Northwest, especially the weather. For the last month, I've been suffering from an extreme case of swamp ass and have fully embraced my spinster aunt self by wearing caftans and drinking boxed wine with ice cubes. And oh my gosh, it's just bad. My AC has been set on a constant 70 degrees, and I have invested in several box fans. I also miss the people, especially my neighbor gang, who did everything possible to get me into trouble and kept me up to date with all the neighborhood gossip. But I also want to give a special shout out to the Major and LT, who did everything possible to advertise the podcast around the office. I miss you two, and I wish you both the very best of luck. And I do have some sad news. Before I left Washington, I lost a member of the podcast family. My sweet dog Amelia. She crossed over to the Rainbow Bridge after 16 years of chasing possums and eating cheeseburgers. Thanks, Mom. And giving some of the best cuddles ever. For the past 2 seasons, she laid right next to me during every recording and kept me company during the editing process. I know sometimes you guys heard her in the background slurping water from her dish, or she would be poking her head through the blinds to see what was going on. She was very much part of this podcast journey, but I know she's in a better place, and she will probably be getting lots of butt rubs over there. Friends, life is short, which makes it precious. There is a special pup in your life. Give them an extra treat and an ear scratch for me. And do me a favor. Take care of yourselves. And take care of each other. Bye.